Welcome back to the Nautical Chronicle. I know that usually I don't stream at all. It's been a long hiatus for the last 4 years, but now I feel like I'm streaming just about every single day. Yesterday, I had a fantastic stream with Morgoth's Review. Um, ye old English salt, the wise sage of North FC. And now I am hosting the one, the only, the IronDuke, straight from the UK. How are you doing, IronDuke?
Well, I'm straight from Australia, actually, but yes, I am an
Oh,
Englishman.
Australia. I could never detect an Australian accent. You
No,
sound like
no,
a
no.
an older man from I think like somewhere around the Midlands or something in the UK.
Yeah, no. I've lived in Australia since 2000. Prior to that, I lived in South Africa for 15 years.
Hmm.
But I'm originally an Englishman from London.
Gotcha. Well, today this is usually quite a naval centric show. This is the Nautical Chronicle after all, and I am actually going to be working on ye old CSS Alabama today. But in camera, I actually also have maybe a future model, the HMS Victory. I was discussing with some of the guys in Millennial Woes' chat, and it's it's actually somewhat surprising how small the Victory is in terms of overall length.
Wooden ship. That's why you can only make a wooden ship without iron framing so long.
Right, and I forget exactly when the Victory was built. It was 1767.
Yeah, 1760s. And she wasn't the biggest first rate ship of the line that was ever built. Um, the, the Spanish and the French built bigger ones.
Yeah, like the
And
Sydneys and the Trinidad,
yeah,
and was it the Ocean class?
yeah, and eventually the British built bigger ships as well, like HMS Hibernia and what have you. But that was after there were advances in building bigger wooden ships, but there was still a limit to how long you could make a wooden ship. And this is why, by the time you get to the 1860s and you're building things like the CSS Alabama, you can make them much longer because they have iron framing. Although they're wooden hulls, they have iron framing. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. But one of the reasons why I have you on in particular is because it's one of the blind spots that, well, I guess I need to preface this with um, the naval and foreign policy aspects of the American Civil War are usually very overshadowed by the glorious battles on the ground between armies. Um, a solid, like I think the statistic was around 90% of both the Union and the Confederacy's total budget was allocated towards the Army, and only about 10% the Navy for both sides. But in terms of overall, I guess, pop culture, um, the pop culture discussion, um, almost nothing is actually covered with regards to the naval theater, uh, and almost no one discusses, I guess, what it was like for the UK and the other European powers to actually interact with and deal with the belligerents in the Civil War. Um, it's a fascinating time in terms of both the 1860s were both a very fascinating time with regards to, I guess, naval technological development, but also I'd say the the machinations of the great powers of Europe, and that's specifically why I have you on here today as ye old, uh, ye old sea salt here to assist in clarifying a few of the lesser known aspects of the war. Um, so I guess I want to preface this with what did the state of the British Empire's navy look like in 1860? Because
HMS Warrior is the first thing I'd say. Go to Portsmouth in England, and there you can find the beautifully restored HMS Warrior, the world's first iron battleship. And when she was launched in 1860, she was easily the most powerful warship in the whole wide world. Her armor was basically no other warship could pierce her armor. She had steam engines as well as sails. She used the sails to do long distances, and steam engines would have been used if she was in action. Her armor was impenetrable to any other warship. Yep, that's HMS Warrior on the
right
right
next
there.
to the HMS Victory in
She
dry dock.
is. She
Yep.
is. She is. As I say, her armor was impenetrable. Her guns were the most modern rifle muzzle loading guns that were around at the time, and they could pretty much penetrate anybody else. She was very fast by the standards of her day. Yeah, she was just like the most powerful warship in the world when she was built. And her and her sister ship, HMS Black Prince, were sent to Bermuda during the American Civil War, which was, the best British base to be in order to mess around with the Americans if you wanted to.
Well, it's kind of how would you say it's difficult. Well, first off, I want to say that, or put a little asterisk saying that this was the first like ironclad warship out there, because the Francis Glouas was, yeah, I believe it came out about a year before.
She was a wooden ship with armor added on afterwards.
So you're saying that the difference is that the Warrior was had a fully iron hull. It wasn't just reinforced ironclad.
Yeah, she was the Le Gouin, which was the French ship you're talking about, was she was a wooden ship that had a armor added afterwards. Warrior was completely built of iron. She was also much faster than Le Gouin, quite a bit bigger, more heavily armored, and had an heavier armament as well. So, yeah.
There's also the fact that I forget when the Great Western, or it was the Great Eastern, this insane engineering marvel constructed by Isambund Brunel was, I forget what the total tonnage was, but it was more or less the first sort of titanically sized steam ship.
She was enormous. Yeah, no, she was enormous. If you go to Bristol, one of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's passenger ships, you can still go and see in Bristol. Not as big as the Great Eastern, but quite a big ship.
Yeah, this was, fully iron hulled, propelled by both paddles, screw propeller, and by sails, and absolutely dwarfed anything else on the seas. Even though it was, like the 1830s, was it?
I think 40s? She was built. I think she was built in the 1840s, but don't 40s. Quote me. Don't quote me.
Yeah, this crazy railway engineer just decided, hey, one day I want to build the best, the biggest steamship ever created, and it ended up being so, I guess, over-engineered that it could survive, explosions, where its boilers just exploded. Could survive getting wrecked a few times. You know, even if it was left to rot for decades, it could still be brought back out of service. It was just that over-engineered. But it's absolutely crazy that this was an absolutely novel time to be a, I guess, a naval nerd.
Yeah, the world was in transition. It was, and particularly in terms of Western European men, they were just creating more and more advanced technology, which no one else in the world could do, basically. And when I say Western European men, I mean that includes Americans as well.
Well, you have to consider the absolute state of the American Navy right before the Civil War. Uh, I do believe I tweeted something along the lines of, there are in general three different types of, I guess, ships that the U.S. Navy had, and on the outset of the Civil War in 1861. I'm gonna try and pull it up. I believe I characterized it something along the lines of, we had our aging, ships of the line, like the USS Pennsylvania, that could theoretically have like 100 guns. But let's see. Yeah. Um, I'll just pull this back.
Clossington,
Mhm.
if you want to see a surviving Isambard Kingdom Brunel ship, you should look up the SS Great Britain, which is a museum ship in Bristol in England.
Yeah. I characterized it as come on.
She's an old-fashioned ship of the line, very much like HMS Victory. Yeah.
Like the U.S. only had really three types of battleship or warships at the outset of the Civil War. The USS Pennsylvania over here, it was ordered in the 1810s. It would have been the most heavily armed warship in the world, but it took 20 some years to actually construct her, and 140 guns. Oof. But it took her like 20 some years to be constructed, due to starts and false stops, like false starts with regards to congressional funding. And then it only made one actual sailing trip from its shipyards in Philadelphia to the shipyard or construction in Philadelphia to Norfolk, then sailed to Norfolk, with
Mhm.
only half of the guns equipped, and then it just sat in harbor until the Civil War, and then it was burned after the Confederates took over the shipyard. So a big nothing. And then there were the large, sort of privately acquired, powerful ships that were stuck in harbor. Like I cite the USS Vanderbilt, which donated by the famous railway tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt, that were mostly just in harbor protecting the ports from potential raiders or invaders. And then there were the various blockading, mostly frigates and privately acquired ships like the USS Hartford. Um, by contrast, the Confederates came up with all sorts of crazy, slapped together ironclads, and wonder weapons that come out of, some of them were literally built in like cornfields or cornfields, that tried to break the blockade. And then there were, of course, the famous, I have a lot of photos in here, I'm trying to find it. the sort of the various privateers that were acquired by Confederate agents, mostly from the UK,
Yeah.
occasionally from. I have a lot of photos. Occasionally from like France, but
Alabama was built in the north of England, I'm pretty certain.
yeah, it was built in Birkenhead
Yeah.
around Liverpool by Laird and Sons. There's I forget what there's a sort of folk song that goes something along the lines of I'll have to actually pull it up. It's
Can I ask you,
sure.
Cossington, are the sales on your um, CSL CSL Alabama, are the sales on that the ones that came with the model, or did you make them yourself?
They came with the model and they're oversized and need to be trimmed a little bit.
But they're nice because with most models you'll end up with plastic sales, which are always horrible.
No, these are the horrific plastic sails, and
Are they? They don't look like they are.
well,
Okay.
that's because I actually went through the process of weathering them.
Cool.
Um,
You've done well. You've done well.
yeah, like I used various oil paints and acrylics to, I guess, get the turn these get like a little bit of weathering inside all of the creases in these really god
Hmm.
awful um, plastic molds. This kit was actually tooled, I think, in the sometime in the mid '60s. It's actually the kit was actually built or tooled for the USS Kearsarge, the ship that
Uh-huh.
destroyed the Alabama,
Yep.
but
Yep.
it wasn't selling very well. So they removed a few of the parts and changed the packaging and rebranded it as the CSS Alabama. And now it went off it was sold pretty quickly, and it's a very rare kit. And there are a few like holes and slots where it looks like there should be an observation deck here, but it's missing pieces, so that it's a repurposed Kearsarge.
Hmm.
Um, but it is what it is.
No,
The
you've done a damn good job with the sales. They look really excellent.
Well, like all of the actual rigging needs to be trimmed and tightened up before and glued together um before I finally like get this thing done with. But um at the onset of the Civil War, the Confederacy sent out various agents to acquire privateers, and the story is that James Bullock went to Laird and Sons and said, "Hey, I'm a private merchant. Wink, wink. Please build for me a steam sloop of war, or just uh, a steam sloop. I promise that I'm just a humble merchant. This is not a warship, but anyways, please cut out a few gun ports, please." And
Well,
they
to
purposely
be
loaded it that
fair,
way.
to be fair, in those days, and right up until certainly the First World War, Britain used to build warships for everyone you can possibly bloody well think of, and quite a few people you can't think of. So
Well, the
there was an enormous shipbuilding industry in Britain in the
yeah,
19th century.
like a lot of these ships were built on spec, anyways.
Mm.
Which means they the the shipbuilding engineers were just told, let them cook, build the craziest, most advanced ships possible, and someone is bound to buy it, whether it's the UK's navy or Russia or Spain or Italy. or Mexico or whoever it is,
Or
someone's going to buy it.
Argentina or Chile or whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
But I believe during the 1850s, there was a mild flare-up in British and French international relations over the expansionism of Napoleon III. And
Yeah, that was weird because I was talking to my friend Aaron Hook about this earlier today. And Palmerston, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, he built all these forts around Portsmouth and other British naval bases. And these days they're called Palmerston's Follies. But they're brilliant because they're really interesting 19th century artillery forts. But did we need them? Probably not, to be honest. But Palmerston, and my friend Aaron explained this to me, because Palmerston was an old fella in the 1850s, he remembered the Napoleonic Wars. And as such, he never really totally trusted the French. But I mean, no Englishman ever really trusts the French, but you know.
Well, it's incredibly ironic that there was both an international scare where the UK and France, Napoleon III's France might have gone to war, but rather than going to war with each other and having this big naval buildup, they ended up kicking Russia to pieces in the Crimean War.
Yep, and then also being allies in China as well in the Second China War. So yeah, true.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of gauging expectations and ensuring that like warships are very expensive, and maintaining an industry to support them is incredibly expensive, but you need it when you need it. And it's better to have these active shipyards just producing all the time rather than having to be dragged into a war and being caught off the wrong foot and ended up suffering because you don't have that industry or forces at your disposal. You never really know when you're going to be dragged into a war.
True. Very true.
And during the outset of the American Civil War, almost none of the foreign observers that I could find really foresaw the scope of organization from the South. From the South's, I guess, very, very fast formation of an army, a standing army, a professional army. And almost immediately, especially in the first 2 years of the American Civil War, from what I found, the UK's public was almost exclusively siding with the Confederacy for various different reasons.
It wasn't quite as simple as that, Washington. You have to remember that slavery within the British Empire had been made illegal in 1833. And there was a very strong anti-slavery lobby in Britain. On the other hand, the cotton magnates, like the cotton mill owners in the Midlands and the north of England, were very definitely pro-Confederacy, and so were a lot of their workers, but not all of them.
Well, like you said, there was the anti-slavery lobby who, opposed, the South on moral grounds. And
stupidly, by the way, Clossington, I will just say this. I mean, if you look at people like Robert E. Lee was no great supporter of slavery. And I think had the Confederacy succeeded, and if they had have got their independence, I reckon slavery would have died out there anyway, fairly quickly, to be honest.
there's some truth to that, where just about all of the Southern founding fathers knew that at some point slavery needed to die out one way or another. Famously, Thomas Jefferson couldn't stand the sight of slaves, his own
Hmm.
slaves, so he architecturally designed Monticello so that his slaves could, you know, trade out dishes and swap out meals without him being, you know, forced to actually see them. Uh, it's and it's due to there's a certain historiography that argues that, like, this is the sort of Christopher Sandbach historiography of the Civil War, where the collapse of the United States' second national bank caused a sort of liquidity crisis where southern all um, southern planters were forced to collateralize their slaves to cover their loans, and the value of holding slaves as collateral outstripped their actual utility as, effectively, farm equipment and land clearers. And the runaway, I guess, value of slaves was such a perverse thing, and the inability of the United States to have a stable financial system caused a certain meltdown where the corrective force that was the Republican Party um, threatened to completely derail the South's economy and destroy their one source of collateral, because the corn futures weren't cutting it for bankers. It was land speculation that fell through a long time ago during the Jackson administration. Um, you know, Slaves were the one source of they were the economic engine of the South, and quite perversely, the only banks that were willing to provide loans to the Southern planter cartels, like the Hamptons and the Davises, were, the Barings Bank or the Rothschilds. And the South was a sort of banana republic toward that was affiliated with Great Britain, even though in theory the Southern Democrats had nothing but antipathy towards the UK in terms of foreign policy for the last 50 years before the Civil War. I have all sorts of wild statements, from um I have a statement from Charles Dickens saying that on one side empire and the other independence, but just about every diplomatic snafu between the UK and the United States was caused by Jacksonian democratic expansionism and jingoism, as opposed to more nativist and mercantile Northerners. It's I don't know how the switch in public relations happened, but I think it has something to do with the fact that Southerners had a lot more publicly acceptable intellectuals in London during the outset of the Civil War. I'm trying to find it now, but um, the main source of war correspondence that the London intelligentsia had. Um, okay, here it is. Like, most people read this, I guess, sort of pamphlet overview of the outbreak, the cause of the American Civil War. It was called "The American Union" by James Spence. Um, it argued very thoroughly that the cause of the American Civil War was over tariffs and national uh, and protectionism, rather than the issue of slavery, which, at the outset of the American Civil War, is very persuasive, because the Republicans at the time, it was politically untenable to support the national abolition of slavery, even from the northern perspective. But I don't know. It's I can see from the UK's perspective, there's a certain amount of Schadenfreude watching the American threat to British interests divide and collapse in on itself, which I believe was the sort of high Tory perspective of the Civil War. Watch as the UK's international or their New World adversary just collapse in on themselves, and
Yeah,
have
some
the
truth. Some
yeah,
truth in that.
and have this Southern Banana Republic export cheap cotton to the textile mills. Like
Well, I
yeah.
mean, that was a very important economic fact for Britain and for regions of Britain. But British support for the Confederacy was fairly cross-party, actually. There were the Whigs in Britain were in the process of becoming the Liberals, and there were some Whigs stroke liberals who supported the Confederacy. And equally on the Conservative side, there were British Conservatives who supported the Confederacy. So it was kind of cross-party. It was also cross-party against it because the anti-slavery movement, although it was mostly Whig and Liberal, wasn't entirely so. But I mean, as you said, Clossington, the thing is, the slave trade had been outlawed years before this, so you weren't bringing in many new people, which made slaves enormously expensive. And the Confederacy was much more rural than the northern states. Most of American industry was in the north; it wasn't in the south. And it was that, along with manpower, and money, of course, that eventually meant that the Union won. So,
Well, I think that it's grossly exaggerated how agrarian the South was. Like they were much more industrialized than a lot of the other European nations. Like it was
oh yeah,
in
outside
terms
of
of
Western Europe, yes,
like
you're correct. Yeah.
outside of like Germany, France, or
And
modern day
Britain, yeah.
Germany, France, and the UK, we had significantly more railway in the South than most of Europe
Oh
and
yeah,
the world.
if you're looking at Eastern Europe or Southern Europe and the Balkans, yeah, absolutely, you're entirely correct, Washington.
And there is a long string of, I guess, more federalist and protectionist American political theory. It was called the American system, but um, it was the American mercantilist faction that argued that we should heavily tariff or we should limit exports to the UK to artificially increase the productivity of northern textile manufacturers so that we can build up our own industry to compete with them. A lot of the southern sugar plantations that had profitable markets in the United States supported supported the Southern Whigs, which were the protectionist party. Um, there are a few other types of planters, but the big one were like the sugar planters who supported protectionism, and I guess the sort of southern bankers who believed that we should be indebted to northern banking interests rather than UK banking interests that supported all sorts of protectionism. Um, although I can, I guess during the Civil War, if I remember correctly, this is the Union's blockade was one of the impetuses to start growing cotton in India, correct? Or I'm sorry,
India
Egypt.
India and later on Egypt. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but since you're a naval guy, I have to ask, where were most of the UK's naval assets, I guess, sent during the 1860s? Like you mentioned that there's a big base in Bermuda, and if I remember correctly, there was a large fleet in Halifax in southern
Yeah,
Canada.
Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is Canada now, but actually in the 1860s, it wasn't part of Canada. In fact, it only became part of Canada. I think probably in the 1940s was when Halifax became part of Canada.
Right,
It was separate until then.
right. If I remember correctly, the Canadian Confederation only really was put together in was it 1867 or something like that?
Yeah, it was finished in 1867. They were building it in the 1860s. And I looked this up for this stream actually. In 1862, Britain had about 30 infantry battalions in Canada, around Halifax to defend the naval base, and also in the Caribbean, Jamaica and wherever else. And that was in addition, of course, to the Canadian militia, which was quite large, and also things like the West India Regiment and what have you. So there was a big British fleet based in Halifax. There was a very powerful British fleet based in Bermuda, and there were also quite a lot of British warships in the Caribbean. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if Britain had said to the Federals that no, we're not going to let your blockade of the Confederacy stand, the Royal Navy could have stopped it quite easily. Actually, they were much more powerful, but it never came to that. So,
I mean, it should be also noted that I think it was in 1837, the Americans encouraged two different paramilitaries to help the Canadians revolt against the UK. They were called the Hunters Lodges, and there's also the famous McLeod case where we sent smugglers to arm Canadian Quebecois rebels against.
tried to do it much more seriously in the late 1860s, and that didn't work either. But yes, for sure.
Well, so I actually have a little bit of a personal connection to. They were called the Fenian raids.
Yes.
Essentially, what happened was, it ex ex mostly ex-Union Irish proto-IRA members decided that they wanted to rush the Canadian border, seize Canada, and hold it hostage, so that the UK might let Ireland go. Where is it? Yeah, I did actually.
It was an insane plan, by the way, but yeah.
Yeah, like in the Erie, Pennsylvania Maritime Museum, they have the ship that stopped a few of the boatloads of Irish paramilitary guys from getting there. A nice little synopsis of what happened.
If you want to know about some of the you can't really call them battles, they were more skirmishes, to be honest. But if you want to know some stuff about that, there's a dude on YouTube called British muzzle loaders, and he's a Canadian dude of Scottish heritage called Rob, and it's an excellent channel anyway. But he's got some really good videos on some of the Fenian raids into Canada, and he talks to some American experts on it and some Canadian guys, and he does some test shooting with some of the firearms the guys were using, and yeah, it's pretty good. Most interesting.
That's a good recommendation. It's somewhat.
All of those guys in that picture are way too close together, but you know what?
Yeah, I mean, it's an old, like, 19th century painting. I assume this must have been commissioned by an Irishman because their uniforms look way too uniform and clean.
And everyone's too close together. Yeah, it would have been great if it had been, I don't know, 1810 or something, but not 1867 or whatever it was.
Right. And to be fair, yes, we did have paramilitaries invading Canada, but Canadians also did do a lot to aid and abet Confederate agents and actual military personnel. There's the famous St. Albans raid where a bunch of Confederate soldiers based in Canada raided a bunch of banks in Vermont and took the gold reserves, shot a few Yankees, and then hightailed it across the Canadian border, only to be arrested by the Mounties. But the Union soldiers, crossed the Canadian border and caused a bit of an uproar diplomatically. But it was 1868, so the Confederacy was sort of on the downturn and looked like they were going to lose anyways. So it's
by 1868 they surrendered, hadn't they? I think they surrendered.
Well, I'm sorry,
1864.
1864. That's when the raids were.
Yeah, that sounds better.
Well, in terms of diplomatic flare-ups, the biggest one between the U.S. and UK was the famous Trent Affair.
Yep. Yep, it was.
Where two Confederate diplomats were on a UK ship from Cuba going to the UK.
A British merchant ship, by the way. This was a civilian British ship they were on. But yes.
Yeah. So this UK ship this British merchant ship was. The American Navy was alerted that these two Confederate agents were on board, so they seized the ship. They stopped the ship. The Americans stopped the ship. They removed these two diplomats, and then imprisoned them in the U.S. And the fact that America stopped searching
briefly, Closington, briefly,
yeah,
they released them after the British really. Basically threatened to go to war with the Americans over this.
So, in terms of the diplomatic status that the Confederacy held in the UK, my impression was that the Confederacy was considered a belligerent, but it was not fully recognized as a nation in its own right.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. Yeah, that's pretty fair.
And the fact that it's a sort of legal gray area because they're like, whose nation do they belong to? Or are they actually diplomats? Did the U.S. have the right to search and seize hostile rebels on a British merchant ship?
That was the main thing that the British stuck on. They said, "Look, you can't board our ships." Basically.
Well, ironically, that was one of the main causes of the War of 1812. The UK Navy searching and seizing runaway British sailors on American, both warships and merchant ships.
Absolutely, it was.
I can understand the anger, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, look, international law is a matter of power, really. It's what you can get away with, to be honest. I mean, you can talk about bullshit like the United Nations and all the rest of it. But really, international law is how powerful are you and what can you get away with? And, in the 19th century, the British could get away with most things because they were the most powerful guys. So
Well,
at sea anyway.
Well, one of the things that they couldn't get away with were the various the various privateering claims, the famous Alabama claims, in which this keeps on falling over, in which the privateers that were aided and abetted by British government officials were like the United States sued the UK sued in international courts for restitution of damages, and the international mediators would eventually, this court in Belgium would eventually become the Hague.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So it was the start of an evil thing, but okay.
I mean, the Hague is a viciously political and biased institution that has
100%.
done all sorts of, well, yes, it is a particularly nasty institution, but it all got started with this little privateering ship that I'm working on right now.
Yep, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, but yeah, I think all international law is bullshit, basically. It should be, what can you get away with? I mean, don't get me wrong, I agree with the Geneva Convention and stuff like that. But apart from that, I think it's all nonsense, to be honest with you.
Well, so I'm not necessarily here to debate the merits of international law and the extent in which it's realpolitik constructivism versus, I guess, liberal claims of international human rights. That's I believe we would find a lot of agreement, but
I believe we would have basically the same position on that, to be honest. But yeah.
But I'm actually kind of curious to see how, or like as a non-American, how the American Civil War is actually taught in the UK, Australia, South Africa, because we Americans, we have a very dogmatic point of view, or a very dogmatic perspective on the Civil War, where the first 2 years of the first 2 years of the American Civil War, it's particularly messy because the U.S. refused to. Preserving the Union is not a very good propaganda piece internationally. It doesn't have very much emotional resonance. And then after the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second State of the Union, he made the Civil War a moral crusade against slavery.
Falsely, but okay.
I mean, it kind of was the main, the elephant in the room. But moralizing about it is...
I'm not the guy to ask about this, Quassington, and I'll tell you why. Because I don't like Lincoln at all. I do really like Robert E. Lee. I think he was a very, very fine soldier and a fine gentleman.
Well, I don't think you understand what I'm asking. I'm asking what the general What is taught
the
in high
general
school?
thing
Yeah.
is that the Confederates were nasty, horrible, racist, and the Union guys were all brilliant liberals. You know, you could replace the American Civil War with the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Afghanistan or World War II. You know, you could do all of that if you wanted to. I don't hold with any of those positions, but you know, that's just me.
I I was just more or less curious if the moral crusade perspective
Is
persisted
100%.
internationally.
Yeah, the fake moral crusade thing is the overwhelming position that you get in Britain at school and in Australia at school. Yes, but as I say, I think it's a fake moral crusade. But okay.
It's very ahistorical, and it's
Vast majority of Confederate soldiers couldn't have afforded a slave if their life depended on it. So
well,
you know,
one of the fun thinkers that has been partially revived by, I guess, the American, or I guess the dissident right as a whole, is George Fitzhugh, who wrote Sociology of the South. Um, he who were the main is court intellectuals, philosophers in support of slavery before the American Civil War. Um, Most people don't actually know who it was for the Southerners, but for the Northerners and for people of the UK, a lot of the you know intellectuals got their pointers from Fitzhugh, who was an American correspondent to a lot of UK newspapers. Fitzhugh, reading him is like reading like a 4chan shitpost almost, where he gets around to the failures of a free society and free trade. Most people are Aristotelian natural slaves, and it's a duty of noblesse oblige to enslave both white and black natural slaves. It's he's a particularly I'm not particularly convinced by him, uh, but he was a very important figure at the time.
Mhm.
In the South, they mostly read John C. Calhoun. Um, Calhoun was the main, I guess, source of political theory for pro-slavery Southerners. Uh, Even though he himself Calhoun had some great reservations about the Democratic Party and the role of capital in eroding Southern sovereignty. It's
Mhm.
I don't know. It's
I think there is. I mean, you know, people call the American Civil War the War of Rights sometimes because they say it was about states' rights compared to the federal government. And whilst, of course, that can be exaggerated, I think there's quite a bit of truth in that, actually.
well, right now I'm actually reading, and I'm probably going to end up writing a foreword for the republishing of Raphael Semmes, the captain of the Alabamas, memoirs. And
That'll be cool.
yeah, and
That'll be cool.
it's I have my personal copy right here, but uh, it's a massive book. It's about 850 pages long. It's a proper brick. Uh, he,
He had quite a few British sailors on his ship, by the way.
well, the thing is, virtually all of his sailors were British, like
Mm-hmm.
except for the officers, the midshipmen and lieutenants who
Yeah, yeah.
were Southern. Um, but Semmes makes a few well, first off, the first, I guess, 80 pages of his Civil War memoirs, Semmes's Civil War memoirs, are essentially an intellectual defense or a moral and legal defense of his actions, saying like, "Hey, I did what I did for these reasons." And these are the justifications for secession. A lot of the moral claims of Unionists is actually both hypocritical and legally untenable because of how the Constitution actually worked in the legal structure of the national American government. Like he makes the case that a lot of Northern Unionism is more or less rhetoric and spiritual rather than legal or even legally enforceable. Like saying that the Union is a divine institution that can never be severed, because
Don't think that's in the Constitution,
I don't
is
think
it?
that's in the Constitution, but people like
I don't think
Weber
so.
made that case. Legally, it's not very good. He also makes the case that most cases of secessionism and most cases of secessionism were originally spearheaded legally by the North, where, like, starting with the Harvard Convention during the War of 1812, where Northern states thought about seceding, and then going on to the about a dozen different cases of Northern politicians arguing that, hey, this action by the Democratic Party is grounds for tearing up the Constitution and seceding. Like, just about every act of expansionism was treated by the North like some sort of case for secession or breaking up the Constitution or rewriting the entire Constitution.
Well, Robert E. Lee, if I remember correctly, was actually offered command of the Union Army at the start of the American Civil War, and he thought about it, and he said no, because actually I'm a Virginian, so therefore I have to go with my state.
Well, most Americans referred to, the central government of America as these United States because they're, for all intents and purposes, separate legal entities united by a common constitution. And the history of the birthing pains of the modern federal government is a quite nasty history, fraught with all sorts of corruption and shady deals. But it's, in my opinion, it was something that was necessary for a few different reasons. And I lay out my case in my last large Substack article, Death and Taxes, on the Whiskey Rebellion and the birth of the Constitution and all that. But I guess I'm starting to get away from the main topic of this discussion, which is the UK Navy.
Crossings, and I was just going to ask you what happened to the captain of the CSS Alabama after the war.
So Raphael Semmes, his legal status as a privateer made him, like, he was not pardoned by the federal government after the Civil War.
Did he have letters of marque from the Confederacy? I presume he did.
So, yes, he did. And he was also a trained lawyer. So he, in his memoirs, he writes how he legally, served each of his captured ships their legal papers, and went about being a sea pirate lawyer. After the Civil War, he was in sort of a legal gray zone because he was a particularly hated pirate. He was able to.
Except he wasn't a pirate because he had letters of marque,
Ye-
which made him legal. But yeah, all right.
Yeah, but the way that the North frame or legally treated the South was as an insurgency, and if he's a stateless actor capturing his state's ships, he was treated as a pirate. Um,
Yeah, most unfair if you ask me in terms of maritime law, but okay.
yeah, so after the Civil War, he tried to keep his head down low. Um, but he took up a few different odd jobs. He tried to, I think he tried to like sell insurance for a little while. He was a professor of English literature at LSU, Louisiana State University, but he was kicked out because of how strict he was and disciplinarian he was. He then, I believe, was like some sort of like news correspondent for various newspapers. But he didn't actually live for too long after the Civil War. I think he died in 1871.
Okay.
But he kind of went from job to job, taking whatever work he could. There was no way that any like northern or any sort of merchant vessel, like mercantile company, was going to put him in charge of a ship, and he wasn't. There was no way in hell that he was going to be able to join back up in the Northern Navy or like the United States Navy.
So
So,
had he been a US Navy officer before the Civil War?
yes, he was.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, he was a captain during the Mexican-American War, and then he was he was in the U.S. Surveyor Corps, or he was on a committee that ran the United States' lighthouse service.
Okay.
He was actually the boss of George Meade, who would become the main leader general of the Union
Yeah,
Army
yeah,
during the
yeah, yeah.
Gettysburg campaign. He was his boss, actually.
Doesn't sound like he was all that fairly treated to me, but that's just my own personal opinion.
Well, he stems himself as a historical character. He was an unrepentant, unredeemed Southerner who obstinately, he hated the North. He hated Yankees, and
There were
they
quite
hated
a
him
lot
back
of those guys though, Fossington. I
in the
mean,
deep South.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah. I mean,
they hated him back.
people like Jesse James, for example. I mean, so
Right.
there were quite a lot of Confederate loyalists, and I don't blame them, to be honest. I mean, to go back to a much earlier era, like if I'd have been around in the English Civil War, I would have been a royalist, even though I didn't and wouldn't have liked Charles II very much. I still would have been a royalist just because that I'm a traditionalist, so and I don't like Cromwell, to be honest. But there you go.
I don't feel like Cromwell's particularly like actually reading Cromwell. He doesn't sound particularly charismatic or
Not my idea of a
or
fun guy.
no.
They tried to ban dancing and Christmas and all sorts of things, but
Yeah. Well, those people went on to create New England and
they did.
the staunch Unionists
Yes,
and abolitionists.
they did indeed. Yes. Whereas Virginia and Georgia and what have you were like colonies, royalist colonies, basically initially.
Well, it becomes very complicated towards the latter half of the 18th century. Um, but yes, I think there's a statistic where it was like 20 or 30% of all of the Puritans that emigrated to New England moved back to the UK during the English Civil War to join up with Cromwell. But it it's the South has a very, especially the Tidewater states like Virginia and South Carolina have a very long history of having aristocratic an aristocratic planter class who are very proud of their heritage and history.
Well, they were even called Cavaliers during the American Civil War, I believe, like the Jeb Stuart's cavalry and this kind of stuff.
Yes, although I'm very hesitant to characterize them as I will get a lot of flack from Southerners when I say that the first few scenes of Gone with the Wind are very embellished. Like the South was not Gone with the Wind. First few scenes, the South became the Southern plantation economy was very consolidated by a few planter cartel families that had
Mm-hmm.
access to Bank of England loans, essentially.
Sure, sure.
And the divide between the cartel families and the average yeoman farmer was becoming much more stark, and as well as the advent of industrial slavery, where you had slaves working in mines and in factories in the South and for
Mm-hmm.
railroads. Um, there's a point to be made about who actually supported the Confederacy in the South demographically, because the very rich planters could take the hit from abolishing slavery because much of their wealth was diversified into like railway bonds and stuff and various factories and stuff like that. And the very poor, like the people of modern day Kentucky and West Virginia and like the rural South who didn't own slaves, could they had nothing, they were competing with slaves that were being used for industry
Mm-hmm.
and farm work. But the main supporters of the Confederacy were planters that could only own like a handful of slaves and were up to their necks in debt. And the abolition of slavery, or the any potential abolition of slavery, was a death knell towards them. That's why states like Virginia took so long to secede, because much of their classes, they didn't have that middle class of striver who was like a middling planter. There's also something to be said about it's the cost of slaves. Like, okay, so ballpark guess, how much do you think a slave cost in the late 1850s?
I know they were enormously expensive because the slave trade had not been a thing for so many years. So
Well, how much do you
you
think
you
one
couldn't
costs?
import them. It would have been like buying a sports car, I would presume.
They cost about between $35,000 and $40,000
Yeah,
for
yeah.
a young African buck. Um, but if you were like a middle class planter and you had like 6 slaves, that's what, $240,000
It's
of
a
debt.
lot of money,
And
especially back then before inflation.
yeah, and if you were able to have like 2 or 3 decent harvests, you would have been able to easily make that money back. But the cotton prices fluctuated so much and were quickly being consolidated, and the margin of profit was actually being much thinner in the 1850s than before.
Mm-hmm.
So they were just piling on more and more debt and had no options and no way out. I don't know. It's interesting to actually get into this sort of well, it's a much more nuanced topic when you're not moralizing about my slaves.
Yep,
Um,
totally agree.
I don't know. This
I mean, look, I've seen people point out that slaves got free medical attention and all sorts of things, and they did because they were such a valuable commodity. Whereas after the American Civil War, if you were a black guy who'd been given, I don't know, 2 acres and a mule, you weren't getting anything,
well, that's actually more or less a Fitzhuism. Like he wrote extensively about how the northern factory workers were significantly worse off than the slaves.
I can believe
Um,
that. I can believe that.
I,
Yes.
I don't know.
I mean, not in every respect, of course, because freedom is freedom. But in terms of things like being dressed and medical attention and food, they might well have been. They might well have been.
Well, the people also don't really consider what jobs what work slaves actually did on the plantation. There's the stereotype of the cotton fields, but most of the time it was land clearing, which is very backbreaking and arduous work.
Sure.
That's
But Clossington, that is something that every settler who went out, if they were going west or something, if they were Americans, every single settler had to do land clearing. I mean, same for anyone who went to Australia in the 19th century. You'd get dumped on a bit of land, and they'd say, "Oh, here's your 6 acres or 10 acres or whatever it might be," and you had to damn well clear it. No one else did.
well, like it's I'd say it's a little bit more complicated because of how nasty the ecology of the South was, where no free white man would voluntarily clear this nasty brush. Like uh, you Brits get a little bit uncomfortable as soon as it hits 73 degrees Fahrenheit outside.
You,
Um,
you,
but
no, don't say that to me, mate. I love it. I
you're
love it.
Australian over here.
No,
Like
yeah, and I lived
you
in
have
South
your
Africa for
geography.
years. I love it when it's 90. That's fine for me. I think it's great.
Well, I have Aaron Hook in the comments saying, lynching before the Civil War was comparatively rare due to how valuable slaves were. It's well, if you want to talk about lynching is a very nasty topic, but most of lynching after the Civil War was a result of the fact that the slaves were freed but didn't have work, so a lot of them went to rustling cattle and stealing stuff. And the Reconstruction era courts were famously corrupt, and by the time of the late Civil War, most of the enlistments for the 6 foot tall, blonde haired, blue eyed Yankees, most of them went home. And by the time of the end of the Civil War, a lot of the people in the army that were in the garrisons were, foreigners, Germans, Irish, African Americans, a foreign occupational army, rather than actual Yankees, occupied the South. And these courts, they they requisited like supplies, food, firewood, stuff like that by more or less stealing from the locals. Like any free white man who associated with the Confederate government could have their land confiscated by these tribunals of occupying Union soldiers.
Interesting. You see, if you're not an American, you don't know that stuff.
Yeah, so what happened was these military occupational courts were so corrupt and so biased in favor of being lenient towards ex-slaves that you had a certain amount of frontier justice, which is not particularly well liked by genteel modern sensibilities. Yeah, so that's what I'd say about lynching. And after the Civil War, there was a book, or not a book, a series of books written by Columbia University historians. Reconstruction in South Carolina. There's a term for it. It's like each of the book is called like Reconstruction in South Carolina, Reconstruction in Louisiana, Reconstruction in Tennessee. I forget what what these books are called, but essentially they were lists of corrupt Union atrocities against the South during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And it reads like a list of grievances. I'm still trying to find this.
Sounds about right. If someone wins a war, that kind of sounds about what's going to happen. It ain't going to be fair, that's for sure.
Oh, it's the Dunning School of Historiography. Basically, it's a sort of list of Union atrocities against each Southern community in each Southern state. Like, I remember in like the Reconstruction in South Carolina book, it lists like, I remember a story where some occupying soldiers started harassing local women, and it broke out into like a minor firefight between the locals and some of the men who were trying to defend their women's honor, stuff like that. A long list of instances of Northern soldiers setting up tolls along roads and looking for a bribe. The main reason why the Dunning School is particularly hated is because it introduced German schools of German historiography tools, such as using primary and secondary sources for all of your historical claims. So every single instance is backed up by cited sources rather than he said, she said, this is just what happened. So the fact that it's so well put together and well documented is a source of people on the left particularly don't like it when you cite sources, and they have the best bibliographies like at the time.
For sure.
Yeah. So I guess we're coming on to the hour and 20-minute mark. I usually run these shows for about an hour, but the fact that it's a weekend, I'm going a little bit longer to like an hour and a half.
Interesting conversation. I mean, you're telling me a load of stuff about things I didn't know because I'm not an American, so I didn't learn them.
Well,
so
So in the last like 10 minutes, I guess we could get into some of the things that I probably don't know about as an American. Like, I have no clue what 1860s Australia was like.
Well, first thing about Australia, which you wouldn't believe if you saw the modern country, because you will see lefties going around and putting over war memorials and monuments to the founders of the country. They'll write, "The colony must fall," and all this kind of crap. And you wouldn't believe that, for example, in Australia, slavery was never legal in Australia. You know, Australia was started in the 1780s, and slavery was illegal when it started, and it's always been illegal here. I'm not saying it never happened illegally, because sometimes I'm sure it did, but not very often. And basically, slavery's always been illegal in Australia. So, you know.
Well, one of the things that about Australia that I'm always kind of fascinated by is how organized even the frontiers were in American history, like and how rare instances of frontier justice actually happened. And when they were, a lot of the belligerents looked for legal protections after the fact, or had legal justifications for what they did and why they did it. Australia has a certain reputation for being, a sort of wild west of the southern hemisphere.
No more than America was, and probably less actually, Clossington, if I'm honest. Yes, there were, like, sometimes some Aboriginal guys would kill a ringer. Like, a ringer is an Australian cowboy. In Australia, they're called ringers, but they do exactly the same thing as American cowboys. They look after cows on horses. And occasionally you'd get an Aboriginal tribe would kill an Australian ringer, and his mates would go and kill an Aboriginal guy. That used to happen sometimes, for sure, but not all the time.
Well, I had George Bagby on last week to discuss American Indian Wars during the age of Andrew Jackson. So that's the 1820s.
20s and 30s. Yeah.
Well, we mostly talked about the Indian Wars during the 1810s, and one of the things that Americans don't realize is how personal Indian politics were, where, if you have a band of Indians and you make an agreement with a chief, that chief will enforce it by the letter of the law. But if he dies, his son doesn't have to follow his father's old obligations. And also their understanding of property rights, where, if an Indian band is hunting and they've, signed away settlement grounds to American settlers, the hunting party, like, they still have hunting rights as far as they see it. So they'll, they'll take firewood from fences and burn it. They'll, slaughter a cow and take a horse because they're hunters. That's what they do. And you might have settlement rights, but they have hunting rights. So they'll take your stuff. And even if, like, one band agrees to cede settlement rights to American settlers, there are 3 other overlapping tribes that also lay claim. So they'll,
100. Look, I'm not going to try and go over it now, but a long time ago, I did 2 streams with Chris Gard about early Australia. And the first one was mostly about convicts, and the second one was mostly about settlers and Aborigines. And if you want to know the Australian version of that, then go and watch the second stream I did with Chris Gard, which I think is called something like Settlers and Aboriginals. And it kind of explains about that stuff in Australia. And it was in some ways similar to America, but in other ways, the Australian Aboriginals were even less centralized than the American Indians were. And so you had even more clans and tribes. And as you rightly say, all of these guys, it was all really personal, you know. And so one guy dies, someone takes over, and all of a sudden all your agreements are bullshit now, you know.
Yep, you're right. It's Australian History, Settlers and Aboriginals, Part 1 and 2.
Yeah, that would be the stream I would direct people to if they want to know what was going on. And Chris did a load of research for that. And Chris, unlike me, is a true blue Aussie, so and he got it right too. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I do remember meeting Chris Gard at one of the Shieldings conferences a few years ago.
He's a good bloke, is Chris.
He is a very good
I like Chris. He's a good man.
Yeah, he's a good guy. I highly recommend that anyone still watching tunes into IronDuke's Australian History, Settlers, and Aboriginals, and the episode Settlers and Convicts, Part 2.
That was convicts was the first one. Settlers and Aboriginals was the second one.
Actually, it literally says Settlers and Aboriginals Part 1, and then Settlers and Convicts Part 2.
Oh, okay. I must have got it wrong.
No,
it was a long time ago. It was a long time ago. So we were supposed to do a part 3, but then Chris's wife had a little daughter, and we never got round to part 3 yet. So there you go.
I just remembered in sort of recent naval news, the HMS Endeavour was actually just discovered like a week ago. The final resting place of the Endeavour.
Oh, cool! I've been I've sailed on the replica, and I've been up her mast too. And I got onto the fighting top the way you're supposed to do it, around the futtock shrouds rather than going through the middle.
Yeah, like I have a model ship right. Well, you can't see it in frame, but right next to me is the HMS Bounty, and the Bounty and the Endeavour are actually pretty close in terms of.
Yeah, Bounty's even smaller actually.
Yeah.
There's a Bounty replica, which I think is the one from the Mel Gibson movie. That's used to be in Sydney Harbour. I don't know if it still is, but it used to be. And you could go on trips on it. They used to do like parties on it and things like that.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, the Endeavour, it after James Cook passed away and his ship was
in Hawaii. Yeah.
Back in the UK from Hawaii. It was used as a supply ship during the American Revolution until it was sunk in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, just in the harbor. Some researchers just found roughly where it was decades ago, but they only now just checked up on it and discovered the final resting place of the Endeavour. That's
cool, Glossington. To give you a final naval thing, have you ever seen the movie The Hunley?
I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen the Hunley itself.
Cool. That would be great, because I know they salvaged it, didn't they? But she was like one of the world's first submarines, and Confederate submarine. Run by kind of semi-submersible, I guess you'd say.
Well,
and run by people pushing cranks.
It was the first successful submarine.
To
have sunk another enemy warship.
There's actually a pretty good movie called The Hunley, which is about the CSS Hunley, and it's not bad. if you can find it, you should go check it out.
I actually did make like a little 2-scale, I guess, little drawing of the Hunley, and then lined it up with the Alabama,
Yep.
just to show roughly how big it was. But you had about a dozen like guys like pedaling essentially.
Yeah, I
And
think they had like a I'm not sure how you would describe it.
it's like a
It was
spear with
kind of like a geared system, and the blokes were rolling this thing in front of them in order to like provide propulsion to the propeller. And then she had a spar torpedo on the front, which really all that was like a long wooden spar with an explosive device on the end of it. It was pretty damn dangerous.
I'm trying to find the. Yeah, you just had a bunch of tiny guys in a tube
Yeah,
underwater
yeah.
with the captain looking.
Braver men than me. I wouldn't have done that for all the tea in China, I gotta say. But
Well, there's also the fact that you literally just strapped a bomb to a lance, and
exactly.
then what
Yeah.
happens when that bomb goes off? Well,
Yes.
the ship sinks, and
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think when they salvaged her, there were still some skeletons inside her, if I remember correctly.
it's very spooky. Um, yeah, it's in a museum in Charleston right now. If anyone ever wants to visit it, um, I have looked up, how much it costs to actually get like a little model of it, and unfortunately there aren't like 1 to 100 models,
Hmm.
uh, but there are little tiny resin sort of like paperweights that you can kind of get. It's kind of cool. Um,
Yeah, no, listen, I'm always keen on plugging museum ships. And for that reason, I'm also going to plug your other model, which is the USS Olympia, because she's a very fine cruiser that fought in the Spanish American War. And you can go and visit her, and she doesn't get enough visitors. So
well,
people should go and check her out.
yeah, like the two different ships that I have in my my main overlay are the USS Niagara, which was um Commodore
She's a brig. I
yeah,
can tell you she's a brig because she's got two masts.
yeah, it was Oliver Hazard Perry's flagship during the Battle of Erie during the War of 1812,
Hmm.
and her model ship or her museum ship is being sailed from Erie, Pennsylvania, all the way to Maine through Canada to have its engines repaired and have an overhaul. She probably will never sail again, but she still has like a little motor that she still uses. And on the right, yeah, that's a photo I took of the Olympia. She's absolutely gorgeous, but she probably will never sail again unless some billionaire dumps $20 million to have its engine overhauled.
She's a lovely ship, and she's got a really good history.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous ship, and yeah, it does have like an amazing history. And I do actually need to spray paint her hull, or I do need to airbrush her hull again because I missed a few spots in my first go ahead. So
I
it's
tell you, Clossington, you're a better model maker than me. I've made quite a few ship models, and I'm very impressed with your CSS Alabama. That's a very good model. You're doing well there, mate.
well. Thank you for coming on to my show. I have what time is it in Australia right now?
Now it's 3:40 a.m.
Jesus, Jesus, go to sleep. I was like, what are you doing on
No,
here?
that is what I'm going to do. Could I just say, guys, if
Mhm.
you're interested, come and check out my channel. And yeah, we do news and current event streams every Sunday. every Saturday British time. And on Wednesdays, we do a history stream. And our next one's going to be about the British in Aden in the 1960s on Wednesday.
Yeah, of course. Everyone go follow 99 IronDuke. Tune in to Splendid Isolation. And I will see you guys on Thursday for the Old Glory Club Pony Radio Express pregame show with Big Dave Martell, aka the Biz Archives. Thank you, IronDuke, and see you all on the next stream.
Thanks for having me, Clossington. Go all, guys.